Welcome everybody to this webinar, Decentering Migration Research, the Challenges of Walking the Talk. Thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Sarah de Jong and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics at the University of York and also one of the co-directors of the IGDC, the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center here at York. This event is organized by IGDC together with MICNet, which is the University of York's migration network, which I'm co-chairing with Professor Simon Parker. So for those of you who are not aware yet of the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center here in York, it's a major interdisciplinary center for research, teaching and partnership in and on the topic of global development based here at the University of York. It's led by a few different departments: politics, environment, and geography and history. And we work across and beyond the university to collaborate with partners worldwide to create new interdisciplinary and innovative approaches to tackle global challenges. The University of York's migration network is also an interdisciplinary hub that brings together researchers across the University of York and beyond who work on migration, forced migration, human rights, social justice, and citizenship. So before we start this webinar today, I'm just going to run through some practical points so that everybody knows how to ask questions and how the video, etc. works. So first of all, just to make everybody aware that this session is being recorded, but only the video and the audio of the panelists are visible. So if you prefer to ask your question anonymously, you can change your Zoom name before you ask a question. And as I said, you can just relax and sit back to enjoy this webinar because we are not seeing you at the moment. I know some of you are really keen on social media. So those of you who are on Twitter, you can find us at York_IGDC, so Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, York_IGDC. And you can also tweet using the hashtag IGDC webinar. So before we get started, I just want to do a very brief poll to see where everybody who is in this space is coming from. So you should have a poll coming up on your screen right now, which just asks you a simple question: where are you based? And then a second question: what type of organization are you affiliated with? To kind of get to know each other and get to know who you are, even if we don't see you. Okay, so I'm seeing quite a few people from Europe, but of course we know that those who are based in Europe are not necessarily from Europe. There are some people joining us from North America, from the Middle East and North Africa as well. A few from Central and East Asia and Southeast Asia. And then a lot of people from academic institutions, but also from regional and international NGOs, the private sector and government and public bodies. So that's great. It's always nice to see that variation of people. I think it's time for me to introduce the speaker, which is of course what you're all waiting for. So Professor Heaven Crawley joined the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University in September 2014. She's still there. And from that university, she's leading the UKRR GCRF South-South Migration, Inequality and Development Hub, also short, MIDEQ. It's always a mouthful, all those abbreviations and acronyms. Heaven will be mostly speaking about that South-South Migration, Inequality and Development Hub. So that's important about her background. She has incredible experience both inside academia and outside academia, and she's very familiar also working for national and international organizations and government settings. So again, very welcome also to those of you who come from outside academia, and I'm sure she's very happy to answer questions from a less academic but more practice-based perspective. We were really keen to have Heaven speak to us today about her project on South-South migration, not only because South-South migration is often not as much recognized in research, and there's often a bias or a focus on migration from the global South to the global North, but also to share with us her experience of working on a very big GCRF project. And as many of you know, quite recently there have been massive cuts in GCRF funding, which of course affected both the content of those projects as well as the partnerships that have evolved in the context of those projects. And so many of us are affected by this, Heaven probably very much so, because her project is one of those really large hubs. And out of that frustration and anger, I'm sure she has a lot of very important reflections to share with all of us. So we would be very keen to hear from you about them. What does it mean indeed to walk the talk, to actually, practice what you preach in the context of a conservative and neoliberal government, which makes such research very difficult. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Heaven, and I will come back when we come to the Q&A. Thank you, Heaven.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that really helpful introduction, because it very much sets the scene, I guess, for what I want to say. And thanks also to Tara behind the scenes in terms of setting up this lecture, which has been delayed. So thank you. Sarah's absolutely right. This has been an incredibly difficult year for the MIDEQ Hub, but actually it's a really challenging project for lots of other reasons too. So what I want to do in my lecture is really talk about the challenges of walking the talk, because this is something that the MIDEQ Hub specifically set up to do. It specifically was oriented towards not just doing research on South-South migration, but changing the way in which that research was done and is done. And that has been very much challenged by the funding context, but I think there are many other challenges too that I really want to talk about. And I should say that this is kind of work in progress, because of course we don't yet know what the outcome of these funding cuts will be. We'll find out in the next month or so. And I think the kind of judgment or the assessment of whether we've been able to walk the talk is something that really can't be done during the process. It will really only be clear at the end of the project, I guess, or even maybe sometime in the future when we see whether or not the networks we've set up have been able to do what we intended them to do. So I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the MIDEQ Hub in case you don't know about it, many of you may not, and a little bit about what it's trying to do and how it positions itself in this territory in terms of the decentering debate. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about what we mean by decentering migration research and how it's situated within a broader context of so-called decolonization of academic research and teaching and practice more generally. And I'll spend some time at the end talking about specifically what I think this particular experience of the GCRF funding cuts tells us about the power involved in this kind of research process, and who does and doesn't have the power in terms of what happens in how we do the research. In terms of what MIDEQ is, Sarah gave you the very long name. I didn't intend to do it again. We call ourselves MIDEQ, which is Migration for Development and Equality. So we see ourselves as being very much able to harness the benefits of migration rather than simply focusing on the so-called problems of migration, which tends to be the focus of much policy debate. And we're really interested in unpacking the very complex and multidimensional relationships between migration and inequality in the global south. And I think this is probably one of the quite unique aspects of the research within MIDEQ is this focus on inequality, because often what happens is there's a focus on migration as process, migration as outcome, but it's really disconnected from the broader local, national, and of course global inequalities within which migration is situated. And so what we try to do is to transform the understanding of the relationships between migration and equality, specifically in the global context, the context of the global south, by decentering the production of knowledge about migration and its consequences away from the global north. And that's really the part that I'm going to focus on in my presentation, rather than the kind of content of what it is specifically that we actually do. And our work is organized around 6 migration corridors between 12 countries, and we have partners within the UN and with the OECD and with of course, our partners in the countries in which the migration is taking place. So these are the corridors, and this is, I won't go into the explanation as to why we chose these countries, but there were very good reasons behind looking at migration through the lens of corridor as a sort of framing device to understand not just the impacts of migration on the countries to which migrants go and on migrants themselves, but the kind of ripple effect back into the countries from which they come, and of course the families and communities of which they are a part. And the reason, again, we'll focus on this specifically, but the reason why we focus on migration between the countries of the global south is that it is a very important element of global migration, and one that's often neglected, in part because the political and policy realities of the global north, who often fund research on migration, are driven by the interests of movement from the south to the north, so-called. In some of our countries where we're working, in some of the contexts we're working, up to 70% of migration is between the countries of the global south. So, for example, the migration between Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa. So our vision really, and I'm going to go over this quite quickly, you can find all this information on our website, but essentially it's about disruption. It's about disrupting dominant assumptions about the reasons why people move and the consequences, and really twisting and turning some of the arguments and the narratives that we currently have around migration on their head by injecting entirely different or often different knowledges about what is actually going on. We want to deepen knowledge and understanding of the relationships between South-South migration and inequality and delivery of the SDGs. This was in fact a requirement of the funder, which I'll come on to. And we want to build interdisciplinary migration capacity, research capacity in the global south by really building extended opportunities for knowledge exchange and training. And that is something that I personally am very proud of in terms of what this project has been able to achieve, even under very difficult circumstances. We want to influence policy, we want to challenge dominant narratives. These are things that I guess are quite familiar to many of you working in the migration domain, and ultimately we want to improve the lives of migrants, their families, and the communities of which they are part. And our approach to do that is really, again, about disruption and challenge. So challenging the conceptual and the disciplinary silos that often we see in the context of migration research, and developing very intersectional approaches, pulling in creative and other approaches, as well as economics, demographics, sociology, geography, etc. We also want to mainstream migration analysis into a broader understanding of development policy and practice. So again, and those of you who have heard me speak before will have heard me say this, the problem with migration research is it focuses on migration, because from my perspective, you can't understand migration or its consequences out with the broader socioeconomic and political context within which that migration takes place. And that includes, of course, the deep structural inequalities that drive that migration in the first place. So situating migration within that context is critically important, as is indeed putting migrants' rights and capabilities at the center of the analysis. So really, let's call it a bottom-up approach. That's sort of a more typical phrase that's used, but really sort of turning on its head some of the ways in which we come at these issues. And of course, drawing very deeply on the expertise and knowledge of our partners in the Global South, to whom the majority of our resources have always gone within MIDEQ, and to whom now almost all the remaining resources are now direct. These are just some examples of how we organize the research sort of conceptually around different strands of inequalities, gender, childhood, poverty and income, but also different areas of research where we look at these particular processes and outcomes, decision-making, the role of intermediaries, different types of resource flow. And some examples from our blogs. We've now got more than 50 blogs on our website from our partners, primarily in the Global South, really talking about some of these issues that are directly impacting upon their work, but are also, engaging with this idea of, as some of these examples here show, why has migration in the Global South been overlooked? Why are the peripheries kind of conceptualized as places of lack, where there's a loss or an inability or an incapacity to do things, when in fact they are in fact territories of focus. So I guess this brings us, I've given you a very whistle-stop tour of what MIDEQ's about. It brings us to this question of what we mean by decentering. And I suppose the idea of MIDEQ is rooted in this, this fundamental concern that many of us have, that there are inequalities in knowledge production, which is to say that there is knowledge elsewhere, of course, but that the production academically and in research terms of that knowledge and the engagement with it and the ability of that knowledge to be able to transform and shape the way in which we think about the world is often marginalized. And I suppose what I want to really put on the table at the get-go is that the way in which MIDEQ was conceptualized, the way in which it was developed as a project, is embedded in fundamental inequalities in the ability to have power in the production of knowledge. So everybody in the MIDEQ project, and there are more than 100 of us, can talk about how our objective is to decenter knowledge away from the global north. But of course, we're funded by a government in the global north, a government with a very deep history of driving and creating inequality. And we have had to necessarily situate our proposal, the work that we do, within that framework in order to secure the funding. So, for example, when we were drafting the funding proposal, we knew that if we wanted to get this project funded, we would have to draw upon dominant concepts and paradigms primarily, not exclusively, but primarily driven by the global scholars in the global north. We would have to draw in some big names from the global north to add legitimacy to the proposal. And we'd need to frame the proposal in terms of the interests of the funder, about which we'll talk more shortly. But, you know, any funder will tell you what they want the proposal to address. So immediately the funder is driving what the focus of the research is and how it's framed. We ourselves, in terms of the research design, really grappled with how do we genuinely decenter when we both want countries to be doing the work, but we also want to have thematic strands that draw across different geographical areas. What are our methodological underpinnings? How do we allocate the resources when global North scholars are often seen as the experts and global South scholars are also often brought in as sort of scholars with local knowledge? Who gets to travel, do the field work? Again, a deeply colonial concept of field work, going into the field. You know, historically, researchers in the global North, this is the highlight of any research project: getting to travel and do the field work, getting to get into the context and spend time gathering data. For our project, that data is not collected by experts or people with specialist skills in the global North, but by our partners in the field, because they are the ones with the expertise, the local knowledge, the political knowledge of the political context, and of course, all the practical skills that you need to mobilize the research. Issues of data sharing are still very dominant in our project because we are required by the funder to share the findings of our data through the UK Data Service with everybody else. How do we avoid the extractive processes associated with much migration research and much research more generally, of course, by making that data available before, for example, our colleagues in the Global South who've gathered that data have the opportunity to be able to themselves write that up, bearing in mind that in terms of publishing, they have less access to resources. They need to frame the results in a particular way to even get access to the sorts of journals that we might want to publish in. They need to situate the findings within the dominant paradigms, and they pretty much almost always need to write in English if they're to engage with some of the core journals in this particular area. So in every area of this project, even before we get on to what's happened recently, there have been huge challenges as to how we actually decenter knowledge production and allow the people who have that knowledge of the local context to be able to bring that to the fore in terms of our work. And this adds up to, in many contexts, what my colleague Carl Lundstrom, who is a PhD student on working alongside MIDEQ to explore whether or not we are, if you like, walking the talk, what Carl would call epistemic injustice. That is to say that there are unfairnesses due to the aspects of knowledge, how it's communicated, how it's understood, and who gets access to it. And I'm not going to talk much more about epistemic injustice. It's very much the domain of Carl's work, but I do think it's a really interesting and useful lens through which to consider some of these issues, not just from a sort of descriptive representation of what the practicalities are, but what they add up to in terms of the domain of epistemology and what it means even beyond this particular project. So that takes us on to the kind of notion of decolonizing research, which, as I said at the beginning, is something which we hear much more about over recent years than we have done previously. And I think the project and its researchers have been in an almost constant tussle from the get-go, actually even before we got funded, about what and whose knowledge counts. And how can we ensure so-called equitable partnerships, which is something we're always being told by UKI is important, in the context of what are actually deep and long-standing inequalities in access to resources for the production of knowledge. It's all very well saying we should have equitable partnerships, but the truth of the matter is that we have different opportunities in terms of resources and we have different possibilities in terms of what we can do with those resources because of the way in which the world is structured, including the world of research. And there have, of course, been increased calls for the decolonization of research in the social science and the humanities. And I think it's really important to remember that when people are talking about decolonization, they're talking about all sorts of different things. So decolonizing involves a multitude of definitions, interpretations, aims, and strategies. Incredibly contested term that spans a heterogeneity of viewpoints, approaches, political projects, and normative concerns. I see this term decolonization being used in the context of research all the time. And I know, because I know some of the research projects, that this concept is being used in very different ways. So what people mean by decolonizing in the context of academic teaching and research, it ranges considerably, from topics such as decolonizing curricula or particular research methods, to calls such as the one that Carl is really engaged in, of wholesale epistemological, institutional, structural change. So while debates on decolonizing research and knowledge production have become increasingly widespread, they're absolutely not new. They go back, of course, to the immediate post-colonial era. And I suppose my concern, and this is kind of a thinking aloud concern, but one that I really hold very strongly, is that the language of decolonization has been kind of institutionally incorporated. And what this does is really reduce the possibility of it actually making a difference. So I think what a lot of the talk of migration decolonizing research does is it talks about the importance of doing it, but fails to engage with what it means for practice. And I would say in the context of this particular project, but actually almost all research that's driven by and funded by the Global North, that the current material, social and political inequalities and the institutional arrangements for the research actually make it very hard, if not impossible, to conduct research in what might be called a decolonizing manner. And for me, the problem is that we can never undo the inequalities associated with colonization because they are continuing. They are ongoing in terms of neo-colonial practices in one way or another, including research. And that the best we can do, if you like, is to try to destabilize or decenter or disrupt current research practice. And that's why, in terms of the title of my talk, I deliberately steered away from the notion of decolonizing, because I think there isn't sufficient engagement with the consequences of colonization and post-neo-colonization to be able to say that our research can genuinely decolonize what's going on. And the best we can do is decenter it. And of course, it's an ongoing process. You can't there's not a process of decolonization, but a process of decolonizing, because it is constantly changing and evolving. And so the reason I use decentering is because I think this definition for me is more helpful. It is really about, and this is just a definition that I lifted from somewhere, to cause or lose or shift from established center or focus, especially to disconnect from practical or theoretical assumptions of origin, priority, and essence. So it's about changing the focus, changing the priorities, changing the way in which we think about things. Does that mean that by doing that, we can undo the structural inequalities that exist, that have existed, that are perpetuated by colonization and neo-colonization? No, I think it's unrealistic to think that research can in and of itself do that. But I think that we can disrupt the way in which current things are currently done in a way that might contribute to some of those broader aims and objectives. Which brings me on very neatly and very unfortunately to the Global Challenges Research Fund. As I said, this is an ongoing issue for us. We don't yet know the outcome of this process. And I'm minded that I shouldn't make any assumptions about what happens next. But I'm also very conscious that in a way it doesn't really matter for me what happens next, because what this experience of the recent months has shown me is it's really brought to the fore the realities of what being part of this system means. For me, as the PI of the project, but also for my research partners, and particularly for my partners in the Global South, who now really understand where the power lies and what can happen when that power is exerted. So for then, those of you again that don't know about the Global Challenges Research Fund, I mean, MIDEQ is funded by UKRI, and it's one of the largest of the 12 interdisciplinary research hubs, to the tune of around £20 million over 5 years. The GCRF is, or rather was, because its future is at the moment very uncertain, a 5-year, £1.5 billion fund. It's part of the UK aid strategy, and importantly, it's tackling global challenges in the national interest. If that isn't neo-colonization, I'm not sure what is. So it's very explicit about what its aims are. It forms part of the UK's official development assistance, ODA, and it's monitored by the OECD, and it aims to, in this case of GCRF, promote challenge-led disciplinary and interdisciplinary research, including the participation of researchers who have not previously considered the applicability of their work to development issues, strengthen capacity for research, innovation and knowledge exchange, and provide an agile response to emergencies where there's an urgent need. And I think it's really important, and I'm, even as someone who's a PI on a project that is GCRF funding, I don't think we can get away from the fact that GCRF funding is intensely political, in part because, of course, it's funding huge swathes of research within the UK higher education sector, with all that means, not just for those projects, but for projects that are funded through other sources, but also because it ties research to the UK development agenda and to its interests more generally. And I think that as a consequence of that, the kind of political decisions and changes that are made by the UK government will inevitably and have inevitably rippled through into what is, supposedly independently funded research that is entirely autonomous in the way that academic research has been historically. So I think what's important for me is that Coventry University, where I'm based, as a UK-based institution where the funding essentially goes to in the first instance, effectively mediates the power of the funder through the requirement to manage the funding in compliance with what are extremely onerous reporting requirements and which are not typical of UKI-funded research. So for those of you that have had UKI funding, you know that there are reporting requirements that are quite light touch. For those of you that have had GCRF funding, you know that there are additional reporting requirements. For us on the hubs, these funding reporting requirements go to an entirely different level. They are, far beyond what any other project in the UKI is required to do. And that's not just in terms of ODA compliance, it's in terms of safeguarding, in terms of risk registers, financial auditing and branding, requirements to have a theory of change, log frame, MEL. These are all things that take up huge amounts of time, huge amounts of resources, not just for the Coventry University in terms of the management of the project, but ultimately for our partners, because our partners have to give us this information so that we can create something for the collective whole. And for me, what's important is not that just the amount of time and resource that it takes, but how we are requiring our partners to do things that are meaningless for them in the context where they work. So a concept such as safeguarding, which is very particular to UK ODA in the form that it takes, has frankly a pretty appalling history in terms of how ODA funding has worked in relation to safeguarding, is now something that I, as the PI and my team, are required to impose upon our partners in the Global South, where, of course, the way in which these issues are conceptualized are potentially entirely different. I think what's important is that this doesn't just reflect the requirements of ODA, but a general shift within academia, of course, which is very closely tied to the REF framework in the UK context, but equates somehow high quality research with impact. So this idea that your research has to have an impact, that you have a log frame that measures that impact, and we can say precisely how that research has led to change, is something that I think is, evolved in UK academia within the last 10, 15 years, maybe a little longer, but is absolutely encapsulated in all of its awfulness in the GCRF program. And one of the things that I find particularly awful about it is that it does exactly the opposite of what I believe research can do, because it assumes that impact is linear, when we know that absolutely not to be the case. So we know that the take-up of academic evidence and analysis is almost always slow, contextual, mediated by others, and particularly when that research challenges dominant narratives, as the MIDEQ project does, including those that are embedded in UK politics, policy and practice. So the idea that somehow our research can change within the course of its lifetime, maybe 3 years, maybe 5, we don't yet know, but it can change the way in which, the normative framework within which, at a global level, migration in the Global South is understood is, well, at one level it's frankly ludicrous, but at another level it's highly problematic, because it just fails to take account of the broad political and economic drivers of those particular debates and why they're being framed in that way. So I think, ultimately we are now tied to the politics of UK funding, unfortunately, and the story of that has been a very painful one over the last 5 or 6 months. But it's a story that actually goes back some way into events that were happening, events that were happening in 2020, but actually from my perspective, events that have been happening for the last 10, 15 years. So for some time now, there's been a lot of pressure in the UK for the official development assistance budget to be reduced. It is 0.7, it has been 0.7% of GDP for a long time, one of the few countries that has had that commitment, or at least met it in practice. But there has been real pressure politically from the media in the UK to reduce the amount of the percentage of GDP that's spent on ODA. And I think that what's happened over recent months couldn't have happened without the things that came before it. So, sorry, on the 16th of, I haven't put the month in there, but in 2020, suffice to say, I think it was September, the Prime Minister announced to Parliament that the Department of International Development, DFID, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office would merge. And this new department, the FCDO, as it's now known, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, was launched on the 2nd of September 2020. Now, the setting of that scene, in a way, by bringing development into the foreign policy domain, effectively, really very tightly confirmed that this relationship between the political interests of the UK government have been embedded firmly in the apparatus of government structure. And then at the end of last year, the UK government, as many of you will be aware, decided temporarily, to be decided whether that is temporarily, but temporarily reduce its official development assistance budget to 0.5% of its GDP from 0.7. That led to a funding cut of effectively £4 billion. It was blamed on COVID, but as I say, I think this story of the reduction of ODA goes back much further, and certainly pre-COVID, in terms of where the political drivers come from. And then I guess we sort of, somewhat naively, it turns out, didn't have any sense of how this would ripple through into GCRF funding, because on the 31st of March this year, we were advised that our budget would be cut by 70% with immediate effect. And aside from the absolute crisis that then created within the project in terms of trying to save the jobs of those people affected by the cuts, it's fundamentally shifted, or at least, well, it hasn't shifted, it's fundamentally confirmed, as I said earlier, where the power lies. So GCRF-funded hubs currently employ around 1,700 researchers, mainly in the Global South. At the moment, our future is completely uncertain. We are awaiting a decision on the future of MIDEQ, as are the other hubs. And there's huge uncertainty about what happens next. And I think one of the things that's become very clear to me through this process is that this was always the case. It is always the case that the power lies with the country and the institution within the country that holds the money, essentially. But I suppose previously we'd always assumed that there was a kind of, you've signed your contract, you've got your grant, you therefore, you then do what you do with that money. In practice, of course, that's increasingly not the case. And I think it actually raises huge questions, not only about our project and about GCRF, but about the nature of independent research more generally, and the way in which it is or is not able to maintain its independence from these kind of political decisions. Which leads us to the conclusion of, are we walking the talk? And I suppose, as I said, this is a bit of a thinking aloud sort of lecture. And I don't think, actually, in fairness to any of us involved in the project, we know whether we've done that at this point, or whether we indeed will know that at the end of the project. It may take many years to find out. And I think it's really important that we don't overly fixate on the GCRF funding cuts, as problematic and as difficult as they've been, because they've been challenges from the very beginning of the project, as I said at the outset. The scale of the project, the complexity and the structure, the changes in institutional partners, the relationships between the country work package leads, the challenges of interdisciplinary working, the issues around multilingualism. These are huge issues that really challenge us almost on a day-to-day basis from the beginning of the project to think very carefully about whether we are in fact just reproducing the existing power dynamics in terms of production knowledge, or whether we are able actually to genuinely disrupt them. And of course, our partners, all through this process and all through the last 3 years, 2.5 years, have been dealing with their own issues, their political instability, violence, xenophobia, in many of the countries where we work, including Ethiopia, South Africa, Haiti, Burkina Faso. And I now look rather wistfully back on the days when we only had COVID-19 to deal with, but it's been fundamentally difficult for us in terms of the relationships between migration and inequality themselves, but also our relationship to the research. So in terms of preventing international travel, really significant shifts in terms of research design and methodology, everything online. I mean, these are very interesting experiences in terms of what they do for the power dynamics of a project. And I think it will take us some time to work out whether or not this has helped or hindered the task of decentering the research. My sense at this point is that it has helped us, because it has actually made it impossible for researchers to the global north to do the research in the global south. The responsibility and the delivery of the research in the global south was always with our global south partners, but I suppose COVID has kind of, absolutely handed it to them, because there's absolutely no way in which we've been able to be directly involved in that work. So in some senses, that's really helped in the decentering process. Whether it has fundamentally changed the relationships is a question that has yet to be seen, because of course, we're at the stage now of having lots of data that's about to be written up. And I think things like, our data sharing agreement, how we codify authorship of outputs, these things will be critical in terms of really helping us to decide whether we've been able to walk the talk of decentering. The onerous reporting requirements I've mentioned previously, even before the cuts, those relationships, those equitable partnerships we're encouraged to have with our partners, how can you have those when you're asking them to do things that are entirely driven by the interests of a partner in the global north? I think it raises huge questions for the equitability of that process. I think we've ended up being very flexible. I think we're incredibly adaptive and we've been very resilient, but I think also the hub has been fundamentally changed as a result of the cuts. And I think the kind of consequences of that have yet to be determined. So I've just got two pictures to finish. This was a slide that I used in one of our executive group meetings with our partners when COVID hit. So this was this kind of idea that you're going along with this very difficult project. We've used the metaphor of house building through this, kind of big, difficult, setting up the structures, the processes, and then building this kind of complex structure around the hub. COVID hit, and we're kind of in this kind of whirlwind of how do we deal with these very significant and dramatic changes, not just in how we do the research, but the questions with which our research is fundamentally concerned, and of course the relationships between our partners in the project. And this is where we are now, or at least this is how I feel where we are now, and many of my partners may feel very differently, but we're kind of up in the air. We've been hit by a very hard hurricane. We're now sort of desperately trying to weather the storm and hunker down and do the very best we can under these circumstances. But the future of the project is uncertain. And until it's certain, I think it'll be very difficult to say whether or not we've managed to do anything, not just in terms of the research itself, but ultimately fundamentally in terms of what we're trying to achieve in terms of the decentering agenda. So that's it, I'm done. Thank you for the cathartic opportunity to talk about these very difficult things that we're in the middle of, frankly. And I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heaven. That was great. I see already 2 questions popping up, a 3rd question popping up. I have a couple as well, but I think it would be nice to just immediately go to the floor, and I might see if I can abuse my position as chair later. So the first question that we received was by Laia Soleiman-Sadeh, who said, I'm fascinated by your talk and research. It strongly reverberates with my recent PhD research on Abdurrazak Gurna's work, which dealt with decentering the production of knowledge and also resisting dominant and powerful narratives. And the question is, I wonder if the resisting narratives and the knowledge produced by the global South are received hospitably by the global North. So did you see any pushback, resistance from your global South partners, and how was that resisting of dominant narratives received in the global North?
So I'm just want to check that I've got the question quite right. So how was the resistance received by the global North partners, or by the, so it's been, I mean, it depends who you define as your partners, right? So, and it depends how you define North and South as well, of course, because I've used that as a shorthand, and we all know there's huge differences between the partners of the global South and between the partners of the global North. These are not homogeneous sort of half of the world and half of the world. So I think there's kind of people who are more or less committed to this agenda. Even within MIDEQ, I would say, there are people, people come to a project like this for lots of different reasons. And we were quite explicit at the get-go as to what we were trying to achieve, but people connect to different parts of what it is we're trying to do. And some people are very clearly connected to the resistance, the decentering narrative within MIDEQ. Others are highly committed to the production of new, different evidence about what's actually happening. Others are committed to finding new ways to represent this, for example, creative arts and different ways of working. So I think it's fair to say, and perfectly acceptable, that not everybody is in MIDEQ for the same reasons. And that's absolutely how it should be, because there's no need for us to have a sort of singular narrative. And the forms that resistance takes, of course, will be hugely different. You know, our partners in Ghana are very embedded in a lot of the institutional structures around migration management and able to influence from the center of those structures. You know, our partners in China at the other end of that corridor, it's a completely different world in terms of what might be possible, what narratives will resonate, etc. So I think each of our partners, you know, resists in a different way that's relevant to the context. And I think that's really important, because if the global North partners were to go in, they wouldn't even understand necessarily the opportunity structures that are available, or indeed the barriers to that possibility. The global North partners, everybody, you know, it's hard to say, because, you know, at the moment we're just talking, right? We haven't done the research in terms of, you know, large scale outputs. We have outputs, but they're quite limited at the moment because we're still finalizing the research data collection. I think it'll be very interesting to see when we get to the point of, you know, hopefully being able to have conferences where we share the findings of the research, how people react to it. Because I think at the moment we haven't really had that opportunity, partly because of COVID, but also because of, you know, the crisis of the funding cuts. So at the moment we're meeting no resistance at all. We're meeting huge positivity about what it is we're trying to do. But that's because, in my experience, if there isn't resistance, we're not enough of a threat. So I think, you know, we'll see what happens next in terms of MIDEQ funding. But I think, you know, we have 2.5 years left potentially, and this is where we could really make the difference, because we've got those structures and we've got that evidence now. And so the last 2.5 years, if we get the funding, would be really interesting. Of course, if we don't get the funding, you know, you could see that as a sort of taking away our possibility at the point where it might become quite potent, and we can interpret that how we wish. But yeah, we're yet to see. But thanks for the question.
Great, Heaven. The questions are flooding in at the moment, so I have at least 5 more, and that is excluding any of my questions. So I'm just going to put 2 questions to you, if that is okay, and if you could just take them in turn. So the first question that I would put to you is the question by Asimina, which is, how does decentering relate to deterrence in the EU framework? And I think she's referring to the fact that, of course, the deterrence of migrants and of migration is really central to those national interests that you mentioned. So that would be the first question. The second question is quite a different one. Sorry, do you have a pen or something to write?
Yes, I'm just scribbling down, yeah.
Perfect. Second question is one by Pierre White, who is asking, do you think that the likely increasing requirement from funders for research to be more environmentally sustainable will also help or support the decentering of research in a similar way to the effects of COVID? So if you wouldn't mind addressing those 2 questions.
Well, on the first one, it's critically important, of course, the EU framework, but basically we don't do anything on research within the EU. So the EU is, of course, critical in terms of how it then does its work, and particularly in terms of our African partners. Of course, we are partners with the African Union, who are involved in our advisory board, and we're all too aware of what that deterrence agenda does to migration policy in Africa. But I guess our main kind of objective with relation to the EU, or indeed any other global North partner with a kind of involvement in this process, is to challenge these migration narratives. For example, in the EU context, we spend a lot of time, we have done historically, talking about the fact that most migration is within Africa and it's intra-regional, and it's not to Europe. You know, what goes on within West Africa is that those people travel within West Africa. They don't travel to Libya and cross the Mediterranean. And so a lot of the kind of narrative shifts is where I suppose our work is oriented towards, because we don't engage, because we're only working on South-South migration, we don't engage ourselves with North-South migration or attempts to stop migration to the North. But they're, of course, the broad framework within which many of these narratives are situated. So, yeah, I would say mostly in terms of narrative change is how we're trying to shift that agenda. That would be our primary decentering approach. And the point about environmental sustainability is an interesting one, because I think even before COVID, many of us I personally and many of us should not have been traveling the way we were traveling. You know, I could now do a meeting or a conference, you know, quite comfortably on Zoom. It's not the same. We all know it's not the same. Just because it's not the same doesn't mean that we should all just be traveling around on planes again. So I think, yeah, I think there's certainly a possibility for that. And it allows some of our partners who wouldn't normally be able to participate because they can't afford the additional cost of travel to be part of the process. So it can be more inclusive. But, you know, there are also issues of people not having access to the internet and the consequences of that. I suppose the only point I would say in terms of the funder is I'm shocked at how little the funder cares about this. And I'm not talking about UKRI necessarily specifically. I'm talking in general. That's not the kind of environmental sustainability. How do you justify spending this money traveling to this place or this? It's never something we've been asked about. And prior to COVID, we had a huge travel budget, and we were never told that that shouldn't be what we did. So I think that shift has yet to happen by the funder. It's more likely to happen by us, to be honest, because I think the funder still thinks that traveling around the world, sort of getting the message out about UK brilliance is part of the agenda, to be honest.
Great. I'm going to do 2 more questions. Is that okay? If I do them in batches, because more and more is coming in. So I'm trying to.
I guess that's good. Or my talk didn't answer anybody's questions.
No, I think it's really good. It's inspiring. I'm just trying to be as fair as possible. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. Do you have any partners in India as well? I'm a PhD student based in the UK whose research interests are in India and China. And they also asked the question whether there are any research positions available in your institute at the moment. The second question is, given the difficulties of being part of the system that you mentioned, what considerations do you have for organizing and funding research and knowledge? Aren't there any alternatives to being funded by global North governments?
Okay, those questions are kind of related in a way because they come down to the money. So in answer to the first one about India, we don't have any partners in India directly because we chose 12 countries for reasons that are explained on our website. But we do intend or want the hub to be much bigger than those 12 countries. We chose those 12 countries because they help us to understand the ways in which, well, firstly, they help illustrate how different migration is between different countries in the global south. You know, the migration that happens between Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire is very different than what happens between Nepal and Malaysia or between China and Ghana, for example. But they're intended to be illustrative of the processes, so they're not, you know, the end of the story. And I think our vision for MIDEQ, you know, if you asked me before the cuts, would be that at the end of the 5 years, we'd get further funding and we would, you know, we'd become a global network in many other countries beyond the 12 in which we're currently situated. But at the moment, we don't have any partners directly in India, albeit that we do work with some Indian organizations who've been in touch with us about this. And unfortunately, because of the funding cuts, of course, we not only have no more positions, we are losing staff. So when we got the 70% funding cut, we restructured the budget and basically gave all the resources to the global south. And so all the researchers in the global north are either working for free or their work is suspended until we hopefully get the funding back. So, you know, it's a really difficult time in terms of the funding, which links to that second question about what else is there as an option. And we're, of course, very actively exploring that at the moment, because having spent what will be 3 years in March collecting data and having literally, you know, tens of thousands of interviews and transcripts and surveys and all the rest of it, we want to be able to do something with that data. It's critically important. So we are looking at other options, but as I say, our funding is not cut at the moment. It's kind of reduced and it may come back in March. But I think it does raise a huge question about what the alternatives are. Mostly, I think many of us end up going to sort of philanthropists as a way of getting away from some of the politics of this, but they of course also have their own political agendas and they're also mostly based in the global north, as I understand it. So I think it is very difficult. I think it's almost as if, you know, what we need, if we don't have it already, and I have to confess to not being at all knowledgeable of this, is, you know, some of the richest people in the world are in the global south, in India and China and elsewhere, in South Africa. You know, we need them to mobilize to come up with philanthropic opportunities to support this kind of work, which is not to say that it would be, you know, entirely different, because, you know, I think there's huge differences between rich and poor, not just between north and south. But I think we're limited on choices right now, which makes it very difficult when the UKRI changes in the way it has done, because, you know, previously that was a really good source of funding. And now I think it's become deeply problematic. And I personally, you know, depending what happens on this project, will be very unlikely to go for that source of funding again. So because of the constraints that it puts on you being in the system, because I think the system previously was much looser. But I wonder whether it's a shift in research more generally, not just in the UK, to be honest. So I don't have any answers. If you do, please tell us, because we need some money to continue potentially.
Great, thank you. Two further questions. One is asked by Gary Craig, who says that he has been working with the Ghanaian project to build educational tools to help young people avoid falling into modern slavery. And he says what was striking was the complexity of migration in just one country, Ghana in this case. So young people migrating north across the Sahara for work, but ending up in slavery, migrants moving in from east and west, rural, urban migration, and so on. And he's saying, I hope you can produce some country case studies to show how complex the local picture of migration may be. And then, so if you could respond to that. And then a second question, if I can continue with throwing batches of questions to you. A second question is from Kelly, who is asking, do you have any advice for early career researchers who may find it difficult to create and maintain global research networks and indeed gain funding for research in the Global South, on the ways they can engage with decentering in smaller scope ways?
So on the first question, I think, Gary, you're absolutely right, of course, and we've known this for a very long time. It's not as if it's particularly new, but I think what is really incredible about MIDEQ, particularly under these circumstances, is what our partners in the Global South are managing to achieve and what they've managed to do in terms of the research. So yes, there will definitely be case studies from every single country, but way more than that. For example, we were just about to complete a survey of 6 of our countries. We were originally 12, we had to cut it down to 6, but still we have 6, so we have 3 corridors. And that survey will revolve around 10,000 people. And it's a survey that really kind of explores exactly this complexity. It's quantitative, but also has qualitative elements, and people have used that for their basis of their interviews. So we're going to have, and we do have, so much rich material that absolutely points to the complexity, but also, challenges the way in which these categories are constructed around certain types of migration, and the way in which countries are seen as either being sending countries, destination countries, or transit countries. I mean, these are very simplistic ways of understanding very complex and interrelated processes. And I think outside of the migration itself, you can't understand what's happening with people moving or not moving in Ghana, and not moving is as important as moving, without understanding the socioeconomic and political context of that country. So much research on migration, in my view, fails to embed the understanding of why people move within those broader contexts. So even with research around decision making, and I've done a fair amount myself, we tend to ask people about, why they move, why they chose to move, how they chose that journey, where they ended up, etc. What we don't talk about is, what were your experiences like in school? How are your friendship networks? The sorts of things that lead people not to feel they have to move or to want to move. So there's a whole range of things that keep people in place. Let's remember that 97% of the world's population doesn't move. So, there's lots of reasons why we don't move. And I think this kind of embedding in context of the kind you're talking about, Gary, in relation to Ghana is critical. It's exactly what MIDEQ does, and it's exactly what MIDEQ does so incredibly well, because our teams are embedded in those contexts themselves. So yeah, absolutely, it's critical. The question about ECRs is really important. We have tens of ECRs involved in MIDEQ. We have teams of between 3 and 8 people in each country who are researchers who are very, in most cases, quite early in their career. So what we're trying to get them to do, and they are doing, is to create what we call RISE. It's a research exchange and information sharing network within MIDEQ, and it can expand well beyond MIDEQ. That isn't an issue at all. In fact, it should be, where those early career researchers in the Global South are working alongside each other, mentoring one another, sharing experiences, connecting when they need to for funding applications or to write articles. So really building up that network of early career researchers within MIDEQ and beyond MIDEQ. I think that could be a really important legacy of the project, regardless of what happens to the funding. And so we'll have to think about more about how we do that and how we reach out to people like the person who asked that question, because I think it's a really important thing that we could do with this project. So thanks for the question and the reminder we should be doing it more.
Great, thank you, Heaven. I guess it's a sign of a success of a webinar when the chair doesn't have the chance to ask questions, because it means the audience is so engaged. So I will swallow mine, and I'm sure we have the opportunity to talk at another occasion. And I wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share, any final comments before I close the seminar with some announcements for upcoming events.
No, I mean, just to say, I think it's, as I said at the beginning, and I think at the end, we're living through this process at the moment, and it's yet to be seen how it unfolds. but I think there's huge amounts of learning from it. And I think from MIDEQ, the thing that I didn't really realize at the outset, which I really realize now, is the learning is not just from the research itself, but about how we do the research, how we work with our partners, how we produce knowledge collectively, collaboratively, independently, but understand very self-consciously what is involved in that process and what the power dynamics of that process are. And I think for me, with MIDEQ personally, those are the most important bits of learning that's coming from this work. And, you know, GCRF is helping us to really bottom that one out, as they say, because it's pushing us to our limits in terms of what we're able to do. But so far, we're still doing it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heaven. I think it really shows that even though your reflections started with one particular project, you've raised so many big, incredibly important questions that many of us are grappling with. So really, thank you for that. Just as a heads up for the audience members, the next IGDC event is next week already. And it is on a very timely topic, namely fighting dirty money in the UK for global benefits. Of course, people have probably followed the news of the recent Pandora papers, but there's a lot of information and news at the moment about corruption. And we have invited Alex Jacobs, who's the director of the Joffa Charitable Trust, who will discuss how the UK and its networks of offshore centers play a central role in global illicit financial flows that, of course, also impact the global south. So that's an event that is happening in person, and you see the link here already copied in the chat box on Thursday afternoon next week on the University of York campus. For now, let me thank everybody for coming. Let me thank Heaven for this really great and inspiring talk, and for opening so many important questions, and for us to reflect together on those really, really important issues. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks, Heaven, for joining us today.
Thank you for the questions too. Thank you.